Ever since the riding of Kelowna Lake Country was first contested in 1997, the riding has been won quite easily by right-wing parties. First, the Reform and then the Alliance, both under Werner Schmidt, and then the Conservatives, first under Schmidt and then 3 terms of Ron Cannon followed. Well, in the 2015 election, there was a bit of a surprise and the Liberals took the riding. Today, the MP for Kelowna Lake Country, Stephen Fuhr, joins us on this edition of Upfront. And welcome to Upfront on this special edition. Special guest today, Kelowna Lake Country MP Stephen Fuhr. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Well, let's get right into it. Let's talk about the riding. And this is a traditionally conservative riding, and the Liberals won in 2015. What kinds of things are you seeing and hearing from constituents here?
There's a whole host of issues that affect everybody. It doesn't really matter what their political stripes are. The economy obviously is probably at the core of those because it drives everything we do, our ability to look after ourselves. Housing's a big one, especially in our neighborhood or our community. And the opioid crisis has been obviously a big concern in British Columbia and locally here as well. I would also say that some other big federal issues are, or local issues I should say, are water. Water's a pretty big issue for us here.
You've yourself described yourself as a lifelong conservative, I guess. Maybe talk about that a little bit. And what about the switch? Where did that happen and why?
I would say I was never part of a political party before.
Yeah.
I did vote Conservative my whole life up until this election when I ran.
Okay.
So I know that a lot of people think that that's a pretty big shift, and it is.
Yeah.
I would say that I started really thinking about politics, both social aspects and fiscal aspects of politics in 2010. Mm-hmm. And the more I looked at it, and the more I thought about it, the more I kind of disagreed in the direction that we were headed. I saw the government of the day start to make decisions based on political ideology and start to stray away from fact-based or evidence-based decision-making. We saw the loss of the long-form census. Yeah. We saw the muzzling of scientists, for lack of a more eloquent word. People weren't really able to talk about things anymore. I get that it's politics, and I get that there will be a political aspect to the way that we make decisions. But if we don't start with good data, good evidence, and science, and then move from that point forward, I think if we don't do that, we run into a place that our social and economic policies aren't the best that they can be.
Let's talk a little bit about what you consider some of your accomplishments since you've been elected here.
One of the ones that happened pretty quick was our Veterans Affairs Office. I mean, the 9 of them were shut down under the previous government, and they were important to veterans, full stop. And when we announced that we would put them back into our communities across country, it was described as they may not necessarily go back to where they were. So I was a little concerned we wouldn't get ours back in Kelowna. So I worked pretty hard to make sure that need locally was recognized, and I'm happy to say that we got the Veterans Affairs Office open back in November of this past year. I would say water is a big issue for us on the infrastructure side, and now this is being taped, but obviously by the time that viewers see this, there'll be a pretty big announcement on water. CKID, SOMED will have gotten a very large chunk of money, at $53 million for the project, of which 30% came from the federal government, to help get good quality water into that community. Lake Country got a good project as well, and West Kelowna. So that is a big deal for our community. It creates great jobs, and water is an essential service, and it's something we need. And it was a problem that was identified to me early on by both the mayors of Lake Country and Kelowna. So I'm happy that we came through on that.
All right, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about a topic that you're very familiar with, and that's the military and defense spending. The new U.S. administration would like to see NATO countries contribute 2% of their budget towards defense in that regard. Canada's a little bit less than 1%. I guess how do we get to that 2%? And can we get there? And B, how long is it going to take?
I think the latest number is 1.1, but it's between 0.9 and 1.1 depending on where you look. Yeah, all the NATO countries made a commitment years and years ago to spend 2% of their GDP on defense, and Canada is not meeting its obligations, nor a whole host of other countries. It's a more complex conversation than just saying who's spending 2% and who's not. Calculation of how that number is generated becomes part of the conversation.
I've heard Coast Guard, for example. Some people count it, some people don't.
Some people count it, some people don't. Military pensions, some countries count it, some countries don't. So we need a level playing field on how that number is calculated right out of the gate. Secondly, I think it's important to see who brings capability, like who's investing in the right areas that NATO needs, and more importantly, who shows up. Canada has a long history of showing up. Regardless of what we spend, we show up every single time. We can integrate with the US and the UK and all the NATO partners at every level of command, special forces, air, land, and sea, and we're a trusted partner. So those things matter, and I think it's a deeper, more complex conversation than just saying who spends 2% and who doesn't. Is there an expectation we'll spend more? Absolutely, I can't deny that that's not an expectation. Will we get to 2% in the next couple of years? Realistically, I don't think we will be able to get there. I think there's a willingness to do more, though.
You're the chairman of this Parliamentary Committee on National Defense, and you had a chance to meet with Senator John McCain, among others, in the U.S., one of the, I guess, the first committee to go down there, really. What kinds of things do you guys talk about? And I guess that would probably be the first thing on the table.
Yeah, we did talk about defense spending, and again, there is an expectation we'll do more. So I'm sure we're going to table a defense policy review in May. I think that will give us a lot of insight as to where we're going. There's a budget, obviously, in a couple weeks. That'll be a small look. If there's not a big increase there, I wouldn't worry about that too much. The defense policy review really sets the table moving forward. So yes, Senator McCain wanted to talk about our plans for defense spending, but the other thing that I thought was really cool was a huge recognition of Canada's contributions in all the previous conflicts where we really came to the table to help our allies. And there's a lot of gratitude there, which was really nice.
We do the tough assignments. Is that what these
We do the tough assignments. Again, we're a reliable, trusted partner, and there really is only a handful of countries in the world that, like I said, can integrate with the U.S. in the way that we do and show up.
I want to talk about our planes, because you're definitely familiar with our planes. As a CF-18 former fighter pilot, we're still flying those things.
We are.
We want to upgrade. The F-35's the stealth fighter's been on the table for a few years now, and there's other options. Where do you see us going with our military aircraft?
Well, we have an immediate need now. We have marginalized ourselves over time down to a place where we can't meet our commitments simultaneously, and there's really a need to be able to answer the phones if defense partners start calling us up. We started back in the early 80s with 140 F-18s. We've modernized them. We modernized 79. We've lost a few. We're down to 76 planes with a 50% serviceability rate. So on any given day, we can only generate 35 aircraft. So we need to address that, and we need to do it quickly. So the plan moving forward is the government of Canada is negotiating with Boeing to buy 18 new F-18s to meet our immediate need.
This is the Super Hornet?
The Super Hornet.
Yeah.
And then following the defense policy review, we'll launch a competitive process where the F-35 will be able to compete just like the other aircraft.
Yeah.
It will take some time to get that done. And that is, the competitive process will be for the final solution for all the aircraft. So I personally think that that's the way to go. Like I said, we need an aircraft now. Yeah. And then everyone will be invited to compete in a competitive process following the DPR. In
the past, you've been against the F-35. Maybe tell us why, and maybe are you shifting gears a little bit now? Or?
I wasn't. Well, I guess simplistically, I was against it only because it's a developmental project, right? It's still in development. It's in SDD, System Design and Development. The costs haven't stabilized, the capital costs haven't stabilized, the operational costs haven't stabilized, although I'm seeing numbers that are relatively high, 2.5 times what we pay to operate our current fleet. Yep. I'm not saying it won't be a good airplane, I'm saying the most honest answer is we don't know. So I would like to see things settle down on the developmental side and let that airplane mature a little bit. If we have to make a decision in short order, I would say that that's probably not the right decision. Yeah. But since we have a two-phased approach, and more time will go by, perhaps it will mature in terms of capability and costs by the time we look at it again in a competitive process.
All right, we'll take a short break right now, and we'll come back with more with Kelowna Lake Country MP Stephen Fuhr. Welcome back to Up Front with Kelowna Lake Country MP Stephen Fuhr. And one of the things your party campaigned on in the election was electoral reform. Well, that's dead in the water now, I guess. What happened there?
And this is also a tough thing for me as well, personally and locally, because I said I committed to campaigning for electoral reform, which I did, and I said more specifically that I would advocate for a solution that contained proportionality. Yeah. And as you said, it was announced fairly recently that the government has decided not to move forward with it as it said it would initially. I can say this, I can say that it was the most talked about issue in the House of Commons for an entire year it was brought up either via people wanting to talk about referendum or just electoral reform by itself, but it was the most talked about thing for a solid year. There was online engagement, there's ministerial engagement, there was parliamentary secretary engagement, there was a committee of parliamentarians that traveled the country for 5 months talking to all sorts of people about this. There was online submissions. I mean, there was really, if you were in this country and you had an opinion on this, there was ample opportunity for you to express yourself one way or the other on the issue. And when the government had made a decision to not move forward with electoral reform, it cited that there was no consensus moving forward. Now, out of the people that were engaged in this conversation, I think, to be fair, the overwhelming consensus or the overwhelming opinion was a solution that contained proportionality of some sort. Yeah. So was there a specific recommendation for a way? Because there's a number of different systems that have proportionality in it. Yeah. Mixed member proportional representation is just one of them. Yeah. So there was no consensus on a way forward. This is true. Could we have kept moving forward on working on a consensus? I think we could have. But the government's position was there was so little engagement in the conversation. I think if you add up all those ways I talked about a second ago, around 400,000 Canadians got involved in the conversation out of millions and millions and millions. And given where we are in terms of a new presidential election in the United States that went places that we didn't think it was going to go, the economy's not moving as quickly as it needs to. We have a housing issue. We have an opioid crisis. I mean, there's some big issues on the table. Yeah. The lack of engagement and numbers and a lack of consensus was the government's reason for dropping the issue. And it's tough. I mean, do I think we could have continued the conversation? Yes.
Is it possible to maybe another 5 years down the road?
I think that the conversation needs to be revisited, but the government's decision for this mandate is it's going to focus on things that it thinks Canadians are more concerned about, and those are some of the things I just mentioned.
And one thing that a lot of Canadians are concerned about, it appears, is the legalization of recreational marijuana. This is a promise that your government said in the election, and it appears it's going to happen. How does that look, I guess? Is it similar to what we see in Colorado or Washington State, where you can walk into a store and buy a couple of joints or whatever it is, and then take it home and do it kind of thing? Is that sort of what we're looking at here?
Well, I mean, the first thing is to address the fact that is it going to happen or is it not? Because there's people that are concerned about that it won't happen. It will happen. The commitment from the government is to table legislation in the spring of 2017. So if we agree that spring ends sometime at the beginning of June or the end of May, we still have some time. And I have every confidence that they will do that. They're certainly on track to do it based on what I see in Ottawa. So I'm not worried about that. As far as what that looks like, they had a task force that spent a few months, more than a few months, 5 months, looking at that. They looked at, how this might look, and they came up with recommendations to the government on a whole host of issues. And they also, looked. We're not blazing saddles on this. This is we're not the first country to think about this. There's other countries and other states in the U.S. that have done this. So best practices were looked at, things that didn't work, things that did work. This all kind of goes together on what the government may pursue moving forward. But I can't speculate on where we're going to go with this, other than what I can say is I have every confidence that the government will move forward with this as they said they would. Once that legislation is tabled, though, I have to manage people's expectations.
Yeah, it's going to take a while,
the
right?
legislative process is not quick, right?
Yeah.
So once that legislation comes through, it'll be debated in the House, in the Senate, and that process will take some time.
Yeah.
So we're going to have to wait, but whether it'll happen or not, I think that people don't have to worry about that. I think it will happen. It will just take longer than people expect.
In the meantime, the U.S. has a new government, and they've not necessarily said that they're going to crack down on it, but it could happen because the states that do legalize it now have an exemption from the federal government. I guess, could that pose a problem if they suddenly decide to crack down at the federal level there?
We cross the border going to the U.S., right? That's going through a federal barrier to get to a state. So that is all something that has to be looked at moving forward with this legislation. It's something that will have to be negotiated with the U.S. because if it's not considered, it could be a problem. So it is a consideration the government's going to have to think very carefully about before we finalize legislation. And we end up to avoid having a whole bunch of travel problems spring up because of this.
Yeah, one of the things the task force said was that they suggested people could have 4 plants at home and up to 30 grams or an ounce of pot on their possession, for example, I guess. Is that something that...
Well, I mean, I'm no expert on this. Yeah. I mean, I've never smoked marijuana in my life, so I'm not. I don't look at it from the perception of a consumption perspective. Yeah. I think it's the right thing to do for a whole host of other reasons, protecting our kids, de-energizing the criminal element, are two really good reasons to legalize it, and I think the data will show that. As far as if you can grow a personal amount for consumption, I think the Allard case pretty much suggested that you should be able to. Now, what that looks like, again, that'll all be unwound in legislation put forward by the government as far as how much.
Yeah. One other question I want to ask is, like when you go to buy a bottle of booze in the liquor store, you know that you're getting 40%, say, on your vodka, and it's a product that meets safety standards and that kind of thing. How will we know that if we're buying marijuana that it's pesticide free, for example, that kind of thing?
Well, part of it will be regulation based, and there's licensed producers now. So the only thing I can link it back to, because I have not a lot of experience on this topic, is under the current laws now, there is licensed producers, and I think there's only 30 something in Canada. And if I look at what they're doing, that is all very, very strictly controlled. So, where it came from, what is in it, all that stuff on the packaging is all part of how they're monitored and how they're regulated. And I can kind of see that being very similar moving forward.
Yeah. All right, great. Well, we'll take another short break and we'll come back with more on Up Front with Kelowna Lake Country MP Stephen Fuhr. Welcome back to Up Front with Kelowna Lake Country MP Stephen Fuhr, and we're going to shift gears and talk about the economy a little bit. Let's talk about deficits first of all. You, as a party, promised in the election, said that you'd run small deficits, but they've gotten a little bigger than perhaps that.
Sure.
We're not in a recession or anything right now. Times it's slow growth, but why do you feel the need to run such a large deficit?
Well, I'm not an economist here, so my view on this is very high level, but I do agree with the direction we're going in holistically, so that's a good thing. We're investing in ourselves, so we have the capacity to do that. Like we have the lowest debt to GDP ratio out of any G7 country. We're not in a recession, but we're fairly close to flat. The numbers are getting better, and we had the lowest unemployment rate, I think, was posted in February for a couple of years, so it went from 6.8 to 6.6. We grew our economy 1.4% in 2016, up from 0.9 in 2015. So we are headed in the right direction. It'll just take some time. I mean, the price of oil after the election continued to drop to below $30 a barrel. So things got significantly worse before they got better. I think it's about up 51 US now. Right. So our ability to recover is taking longer, and that bottom out was a lot deeper than a lot of people projected. So, and on top of all that, we need to start to change the way we do things. I mean, oil is a big part of our economy, and it's certainly our short-term and medium-term it's medium-term, short-term, medium-term issue for us. Yep. We need to do that for jobs and growth. But the long-term plan is, low-carbon, knowledge-based economy. So we have to start to transition to do it. It's a tough time to do it right now when a lot of people are hurting because of the energy sector.
It's still a hangover, isn't it, in some respects from 2008 kind of thing? The slow growth that the world is seeing
we hurt less in the 2008 recession than most first world countries because our banking system was very stabilized. But we never really recovered in great bounds. Like we just kind of stayed flat, and we've had moments of regression, but it takes a while to stop the ship, turn it around, and point it in a different direction. And that's ultimately what people voted for. They wanted a different approach. And we never did get any of the big 4 or 5 pipeline projects through under the other previous government, and we're hoping to get a couple of them through in this next mandate as a balanced approach to going from recognizing that oil and gas is an important part of our economy and then shifting gears moving forward in the future to a knowledge-based low-carbon economy. We also have to think about automation. A lot of the things that we do now are going to be automated. So how are we going to deal with that moving forward?
Let's talk about infrastructure a little bit, because many economists would agree that that's not bad bang for your buck, to invest in roads and bridges and that kind of thing. When are we going to see that kind of stuff happening?
Well, as I mentioned,
tunnels, bridges.
Locally, water's huge, right? So when I met with the mayor before I was elected, I asked both Mayor Baker and Mayor Bazaran what their biggest concerns were. Colin Bazaran, water was at the top of his list, and he was. There's some local politics, obviously, but the need's there. So we've come a long way in the last 2 years, and we've got some significant federal and provincial funding for water infrastructure here in our community, which is great. It's great because water is an essential service at your house, along with power and sewer. So that's a necessity, and it's going to create a whole host of great jobs for the next couple of years in the interim. So it's a win-win for everybody.
I know you said you're not an economist, but I always wanted to ask a federal MP this. Equalization payments in Canada.
Right.
Quebec gets an awful lot of that money. In 17-18, over $11 billion. A lot of that comes from, what we in the West think, from our taxpayers, BC, Alberta specifically. Are they really a have-not province?
Well, and again, on the surface, that's what I agree, that's probably what it appears to be. But
Yeah.
money goes to the federal treasury and then money's dispersed from the federal treasury. So there's not BC is paying for anybody else. It's
Right.
not going from one to another. Everyone pays into a general pool in the federal treasury.
But they get more still.
Well, and then money's transferred back out. There's a healthcare transfer, there's a social transfer, and there's equalization. I believe BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Labrador, Newfoundland are the only provinces that don't get it.
Yeah.
The rest get varying amounts,
Yeah.
but depending on a formula that's put together. And it is contentious, but the government of Canada has a constitutional responsibility to make sure that Canadians across this massive country have the same level of service. So that equalization payment, however it's calculated, is given to the provinces unconditionally that do get it, and then they can put it towards whatever it is that they need to get that level of service where it needs to be. So we don't have these massive swings in education or healthcare delivery across the different provinces in this country. Yeah. And I understand it is contentious
out here,
and everybody has an opinion, and I get that. But I do, on a bigger national scale, understand why it is the way it is. And that's pretty much all I have now.
All right, good. I want to talk about housing a little bit, because I guess if you had invested in real estate in 2008, you'd probably be doing all right now. I mean, the housing really gone crazy. Some people are concerned we're in a housing bubble, especially in Toronto and Vancouver and even Hamilton, I said the other day. Does that concern you? I mean, I know the federal government's made a number of changes to make it more difficult to get a mortgage thing, but do we need to do more?
I think, well, first of all, the federal government's kind of coming back on the scene in terms of the conversation. I mean, there is money that moves to the provinces to help out with housing strategies and homelessness and affordable housing, and that's been there for years. There's been more fiscal resources put into that since budget 2016, like significantly more money. But more important, the federal government wants to be part of the conversation, because it's going to take not just money and resources, but it's going to take a whole bunch more things, and that is really rooted in a relationship between the feds and the province. Ultimately, the municipalities and the provinces deliver housing, and the feds are kind of outside that circle, but they want to be involved because it's a challenge. With regard to the bubble, Vancouver, Toronto, and the closest one of those two to us is Vancouver. Yeah, we're seeing that people are capitalizing on selling their homes in Vancouver. They can move to Kelowna for a very similar lifestyle and capitalize on the sale of their home in Vancouver, and come to Kelowna, get something, live a similar lifestyle, buy a house at half the money, but that's driving costs up here.
Yeah, for sure. All right, well, we'll take another short break. We'll come back with more with Kelowna Lake Country MP Stephen Fuhr on Upfront. Well, welcome back to Upfront, and let's keep it in the economy for a little bit. Let's talk about NAFTA. Donald Trump wants to renegotiate the NAFTA agreement, and Canada generally has a balanced trade for the most part with the United States, as opposed to, say, Mexico. But are we concerned when they open up something like that, or do we see it as an opportunity?
Well, it depends how you look at it, right? So I think the good news is we went from an early Trump campaign that there were some suggestions of ripping NAFTA up in the most extreme form of just the discussion to it'll be tweaked. And that is, of course, it's a concern. I think the important part in the strategy has been really, really good on the Canadian side of the border, which is basically educating the American side of the border as to how balanced that relationship is. Because on the outset, you look, well, Canada's 10 times smaller than the US in pretty much every way you can measure that relationship. So you would assume, most people assume that we rely on the US more than they rely on us. But if you drill down, you'll find out that, like you just mentioned, that trade relationship is pretty balanced. And but a lot of people don't realize that. I think 35 of the US's 50 states, their biggest export market's Canada. 9 million direct jobs depend on Canada. So
we buy their stuff.
And out of all the states, or 48 of them anyhow, Canada's in their top 3 of who they export to the most. So the challenge is to make sure that we have allies on the other side of the border rallying to keep that relationship healthy. So the congressmen and the senators of those 35 states that rely on Canada economically, they need to be reminded or told told how much we actually mean to their state. So when this conversation is going on, when the Canadians aren't at the table, they recognize that the relationship with Canada is just as important to them as it is to us.
Well, throughout our broadcast today, we will take some questions from viewers, and here's one now.
My name is Milt Pavlich. My question is, what do you think of Donald Trump?
Well, you didn't get a chance to meet him on your recent trip to the United States, but I guess what they just want to know is your feeling on perhaps negotiating NAFTA or other things like that with the new president.
Well, I mean, the U.S. had a general election just like we had in 2015, and they made a decision. So they're going to work their way through that decision. What I can say is that the relationship with the United States that Canada has, both defense-wise and economically, is tremendously important to us. So it is really, really important that we have strong, good, collaborative ties with that administration, and that's kind of what we're focused on. Where we differ on certain issues, Canada will stand on its own ethics and morals. And like the Prime Minister said, it's not in his mandate, and it's certainly not in his. He doesn't think it's a good way to proceed. It's just to be openly critical of any duly elected leader and how they manage themselves. So we're just steering away from that. We want to focus on the relationship, respect the office, and make sure that the Canadians continue to benefit from the relationship, just like the Americans can.
All right, here's another question from email this time from Mel and Bev. During 2016, more than 90,000 Christians died because they believed in the story of God and Jesus. Why has your government done so little to bring these people safely to Canada? And I think what they're referring to is the ISIS killing Christians in Syria and Iraq and places like that. And some countries have classified that as genocide, but Canada has chosen not to.
Right. This is a tough conversation. There is a ton of need, and there's a ton of, many people that need help right now. We don't discriminate, so religious affiliation is not part of the equation. The government of Canada goes on need, essentially, and that in part they work with the UNHCR to determine who's in the biggest need. I mean, humanitarian crisis, displacement, there's all sorts of things that come into it, but religious affiliation is not part of the equation, and it is heartbreaking to think that people are not getting safe havens, whether it be countries like Canada or the U.S. or other countries in the world, and because there's a lot of need out there. Canada is doing what it can, and it has been praised very, very heavily by the UNHCR, which is kind of the authority on this, on our capacity and our ability to get people here in a quick fashion.
All right, we've got time for one more question from a viewer.
Hi, my name is Devin Rooney. I'd like to ask the Member of Parliament how the community and the government are going to increase resources for the youth, and in particular youth that are dealing with issues like homelessness, that come from good homes or don't come from good homes, and how the community is going to react to put in more social programs to make sure that the youth have more access to education and grants for education.
I think in generally what they're asking there is, what is the federal government doing for at-risk youth, young people?
Well, there's a host of programs that have been in place for some time now. On the infrastructure side, there's several envelopes of money that are introduced in budget 2016 on a massive scale moving forward. One of them is social infrastructure, so there's money for homelessness partnering strategy, and a whole other host of things that the federal government delivers to at-risk youth. With regard to education moving forward, for some of the folks that end up going to school, there's an increase to grants from the federal government. Depending on your income level, it could be as much as 50% increase in grants, and your ability to pay back your loan if you go to school is now, you won't have to pay anything back until you're earning about $25,000 a year.
All right, well, that wraps up our show today. Thanks for joining us, taking the time to do this.
My pleasure, thanks for having me.
And that wraps up our show today with Kelowna Lake Country MP Stephen Fuhr. This has been Upfront.